All right, week 12 and CIT93. And I just finished the code up for this week. And it's one of those really fundamental things in JavaScript to understand. And I think the book does a really nice job here of laying out some of the more common ways of doing form validation. So that's nice. And the nice thing too, I think, is that I didn't plan this honestly. This code up is shorter, so it will leave, in my hope, some gap time for you to then work on the other item that I'm going to have available this week, which I gave you the heads up before on. So we'll go over that in a second, right? So as before, you'll have things you need to answer. As a matter of fact, rather than do that, let's just go ahead and move over and check it out. So here it is, right? And you can see the develop it that I'm going to start working on. I have kind of outlined it already, but in this case, we're looking at form validation. So, and I don't have as many points of commits because there's just not as much code, much content, therefore code. But as before, I do have some questions I want you to answer here. Okay. So I'm going to bring over my Windows setup because the other thing, and I don't think we've talked much, if hardly any, about this, is that, and this is the output of the form, and it's really nice the way they did the email, and then introduces the idea of regular expressions, patterns, the constraint API, which I don't think the book did a great job of actually. They talk about, that it's not as used or not as supported on Safari, but this is also why I want you to get used to looking at a website called Can I Use? Because Can I Use is a really important thing. Because from the time they wrote this book until now, you can see that in Safari it's green, which means you can, as a matter of fact, you can say here that about 95% of all browsers support the constraint API. Okay, and you can see in here, and actually this is answering some of the questions I had, so it's okay, it's good, is what is the constraint API, right? Because they talk about it, but then they don't make a direct correlation when you're doing things what it is, but it's really when you're setting, these are the three methods that you can call, and these are built into the browser, right? So understanding that's why understanding the browser support is therefore important. So that's one thing, is having because when you start looking around and trying to get inspiration, right, for stuff that you're going to create, it's important to understand how well that those items are supported, or how well that function is supported or method is supported inside the browser, and using Can I Use is way important. So the other thing that we have not talked about much that I think is definitely worth mentioning, and I suspect some of you, because you've taken Todd's 85 class, are used to hopefully looking at MDN. Okay, so the Mozilla Developer Network, and then looking on here, I think it's also worth reading through the validation page on here and talking about client versus server validation, and because we use in this chapter, right, client validation. If you move on to Node, you'll hear and experience the server side validation, right? So, but I think this is just a really good page to review and understand what this is, because we also end up using pseudo styles to help give affordances. This is what we call a user affordance to when we're entering fields, that they're required, or if they're valid or not, right? So it's nice that it changes that from the red outline, meaning it wasn't valid, to the blue, which basically just turns off the red because it becomes valid. So it's understanding the way that is handled. Okay, so the last thing I'll just start to touch on is because I've just drafted a few ideas here, is that our develop three, which is going to be the Sunday night item this week, and again it'll be this week and next that we have this additional item, is really starting to look at really starting a little sooner than I anticipated this project scope. And as I reflected before, we're going to do it in a way that shares your output with everyone in the class so that everybody gets an idea of what other people, how they approach it, how they look at it. But somewhat like we did, for, and let me just bring you back here for a second, somewhat like we did with the develop 1 and 2. I want to have you write a user story, and then I want you to also outline the modules that you're going to use, right? So I want you, but this time, and this is the part I need to work on, so I'm just telling you, before, and this is a kind of a preview for what's to come. So in this next round, there's going to be a couple of course added things, which is, using the pattern of modules, understanding the methods, the constructors, creating the constructors, instantiating the objects, using the methods, and then also having, capturing user input and responding to that input. Okay. So as I had said before, I am going to continue now because I've given it enough thought that I think I can make it work the way I want. Is I'm going to take my JavaScript that I wrote for develop 1 and 2 for the kitty cat match, and I'm going to place a login, capture that user login, and then I'm going to write some user data as when the user first logs in, and then I'm going to handle the gameplay in a modular way versus the way I've done it with functions, and then I'm going to write the game results, and that's something I got to work on, to the database, to the Firebase. Okay, so I had you before today go ahead and at least begin, to see the beginnings of a login, and think about how you would use it. So so let me just say this. If you don't use a user login, which you don't have to, you have to somehow gather user input and store that input and respond to that input in some meaningful way. Okay, so in the coffee run, right, we got in a customer order, we displayed it back to the customer, and then we created a checklist that the idea of the delivery, right? So you need to have something of meaning. So you're capturing user data, you're responding to user data. Okay, so I want you to that's what I want you to kind of think about in addition to what you're going over in the code up here. Okay, all right, that's about it. So my job now is to work on that for our develop 3. And then you'll see a video from me hopefully today or definitely over the weekend, because my goal has always been, and I believe I've kept this every time, is to have content a week ahead of you. I am traveling next weekend, going down to LA to speak at a DevFest. So I got to giddy up and get next week's items done. Next week we move on to Ajax, which is really fun. And then we'll, actually, I think next week is the last code up, actually. Yeah, it is. Next week is the last code up. I don't have it in our schedule to look at promises. Promises were introduced conceptually in the Firebase code along, or the additional item I had you do for the last item we did. So promises are one of those things that it takes you a while to do, because callbacks, we kind of, hopefully you're starting to get that idea, right? Is that you do something, and then when you're done you call back, and here's the callback. What happens is, the reason we have to bind is we lose the stack, and you have to bind things into that, and the callback can do something called callback hell, where you're just calling back and it's really not really gnarly code. And so promises is a much better, more efficient way that you can handle different conditions that come back from code that you call, and then depending on the results you can handle that differently. But promises are good to understand, and I don't have it on our schedule, but I'm going to recommend at the end of this that you definitely check those next chapters out, because it'll be part of where we start talking in 94 Because first we got to give everybody who hasn't had JavaScript some JavaScript level up. Anyway, enough for today. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.